Humiliated and rejected by a millionaire during an interview, a young man without a degree creates a startup that quickly threatens the empire of the man who despised him. But when the desperate millionaire comes to him with an offer he can't refuse, Lucas' response leaves everyone in shock. The narrow streets of Lucas' neighborhood were filled with the familiar sounds of bustling morning traffic and vendors setting up their stalls. It was a modest part of the city, where the air was always thick with a blend of hope and struggle. Lucas stepped out of the tiny apartment he shared with his mother, his heart pounding in his chest. Today was the day that everything could change. His mother, sitting at the small kitchen table, had wished him luck with a smile that was both encouraging and tired. She had worked her whole life to support him, and now, at 22, Lucas felt the weight of her sacrifices on his shoulders. Every step he took felt like one closer to breaking the cycle of poverty they had been stuck in for so long. As he walked toward the bus stop, Lucas mentally rehearsed everything he had read about the company. TechVision, one of the most prestigious tech companies in the city, had always been his dream. They were known for their groundbreaking work in artificial intelligence and software development. Getting a job there would not only validate his skills but also change his family's future. It was more than just a job interview, it was a lifeline. The bus ride to the heart of the city was long, but Lucas barely noticed. His mind was flooded with visions of what could be. He imagined walking into the grand offices of TechVision every morning, surrounded by cutting-edge technology and brilliant minds. In his fantasies, he was already part of their world, a world far removed from the peeling paint and cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. The bus finally pulled up to his stop, and Lucas stepped off, standing for a moment to take in the city around him. The towering skyscrapers gleamed under the morning sun, their windows reflecting the sky. Everything here was so polished, so clean, an entirely different universe from where he'd come from. The contrast made his stomach churn, but he swallowed his nerves and pressed on. When he reached the entrance of TechVision's building, Lucas paused to look up at the gleaming structure. Its sleek glass walls seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, dwarfing everything around it. He took a deep breath, wiped his sweaty palms on his pants, and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was even more impressive than he had imagined. Polished marble floors, towering potted plants, and abstract art pieces gave the space a cold, sterile elegance. Everything here screamed success. Lucas approached the receptionist, who greeted him with a professional smile and directed him to the 23rd floor, where his interview would take place. As the elevator ascended, Lucas could feel the pressure building in his chest. He clutched his portfolio tightly, knowing that this was his chance to prove himself. Despite his humble background and the fact that he didn't have the prestigious education many of the other candidates likely did, Lucas knew he had the talent. He had spent countless nights teaching himself how to code, learning the intricacies of artificial intelligence from online courses. What he lacked in resources, he made up for in raw determination. When the elevator doors opened, Lucas stepped into the hallway. The entire floor was open plan, with sleek desks and glass-walled meeting rooms. It felt like he had entered another world, one that seemed light years away from his own life. As he was led to the waiting area, Lucas caught a glimpse of the kind of people who worked here, young professionals in tailored suits, discussing complex projects with confidence. He sat down, trying to calm his nerves, but every glance at the immaculate office space made him feel more out of place. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the polished shoes of those walking by, their quiet confidence a stark contrast to his growing anxiety. Lucas looked down at his own worn-out shoes, the soles frayed from years of use. It was a small reminder of the gap between him and the world he was trying to break into. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. What if I'm not good enough? He thought. What if they see me for what I really am, just a kid from the wrong side of town? But then he remembered his mother's face that morning, the pride in her eyes, and he pushed the doubt aside. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for her, for all the sacrifices she had made. And that thought gave him strength. Lucas sat in the waiting area, his foot tapping nervously against the polished floor. The sound echoed in the otherwise quiet space, adding to his sense of unease. Every time someone walked by, his eyes darted toward them, wondering if it was his turn. The receptionist finally called his name, and Lucas stood up, clutching his portfolio as if it were a lifeline. He was led down a long hallway, the walls adorned with sleek, modern art that seemed too expensive for him to even look at for too long. His heart raced as they approached a large, frosted glass door at the end of the hall. His palms were slick with sweat again, and he quickly wiped them on his pants before the door swung open. Inside the conference room, sitting at the head of a long, shiny table, was Marcos. He was exactly the type of man Lucas had imagined would run a company like TechVision, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Lucas made in a year. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes gleamed with the confidence of someone who had never known failure. "Lucas, is it?" Marcos didn't stand to greet him. He barely even looked up from the papers on the table in front of him. "Yes, sir," Lucas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He moved to sit, but Marcos held up a hand, stopping him before he could pull out the chair. "Not yet. Let's keep this quick," Marcos said, finally lifting his gaze to appraise Lucas. The way his eyes flicked over him, from his shoes to his worn jacket, was cold and dismissive. Lucas could feel the judgment in that brief glance. Lucas swallowed hard, standing awkwardly by the chair, feeling smaller than ever. He had faced his share of difficulties growing up, but nothing had prepared him for this. "So, I see you've applied for the software development position," Marcos said, flipping through Lucas's resume. "You're self-taught?" "Yes, I've been programming for several years now." From free online courses, I assume?" Marcos interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. Lucas hesitated for a second. "Yes, I learned through online resources and—" "I see," Marcos said, cutting him off again. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table, clearly unimpressed. "No degree. No formal training. And you think you're ready to work at TechVision?" Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected to be dismissed so quickly, without even being given a chance to explain what he could do. Marcos chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I admire your ambition, really. But this," he gestured vaguely at Lucas's resume. "This isn't enough. We're looking for professionals, not amateurs." Lucas felt the sting of those words, but he stood his ground. "I may not have formal education, but I've built several projects from scratch. I have the skills you're looking for." "Skills?" Marcos interrupted, leaning forward with a smirk. "Skills are a dime a dozen, especially ones you can pick up on YouTube. Do you even know how competitive this field is? How much experience our team has?" "I understand that," Lucas replied, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his stomach churned with a mix of anger and humiliation. "But I believe I can bring something valuable to the table." Marcos laughed, louder this time. It was a cruel sound, one that bounced off the cold glass walls. "Something valuable? Kid, look around you." He gestured to the view outside the window, the sprawling city, the towering skyscrapers, the world of success that Lucas was so desperate to be a part of. "Do you really think this is where someone like you belongs? No degree, no connections. You've got guts, I'll give you that, but this is the real world?" For a moment, the room felt like it was closing in on Lucas. He looked down at his shoes again, the same shoes he'd been ashamed of earlier. Now, they felt even more out of place here, in this world of wealth and power. Marcos glanced at his watch, clearly done with the conversation. "I think we've wasted enough time. Good luck with your projects. But TechVision? It's out of your league." Lucas stood frozen, the rejection stinging more than he had imagined it would. He had prepared for difficult questions, for challenges, but not for this. Not for this outright humiliation. Without another word, Marcos turned back to his papers, signaling that the meeting was over. Lucas took a deep breath, nodded stiffly, and turned to leave, his chest tight with a mix of anger, embarrassment, and disappointment. As he walked out of the building, the towering skyscrapers that had once inspired hope now seemed like impossible walls he would never be able to scale. The cold air hit Lucas as he stepped out of TechVision's towering building. The noise of the city seemed distant, muffled by the pounding in his ears. He felt hollow, like the rejection had carved something out of him, leaving an empty shell where his confidence once was. He walked aimlessly down the street, clutching his portfolio tightly against his chest, though it now felt like a weight, a reminder of his perceived inadequacy. His mind replayed Marcos's words over and over. "This isn't where someone like you belongs." Each time, the words stung a little deeper. He stopped at the edge of a busy intersection, unsure of where to go. For a moment, the dream that had once seemed so close now felt completely out of reach. As Lucas stood lost in thought, a voice called out behind him. "Hey! Excuse me, Lucas, right?" He turned around, surprised that anyone would know his name. A woman in her mid-30s, dressed sharply but with a warm smile, was hurrying toward him. Her brown hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and her eyes held an intensity that immediately commanded attention. She didn't look like someone who just humiliated him, and yet Lucas's guard was still up after the interview. "Yes." Lucas responded cautiously, wiping his clammy hands on his pants. "I'm Helena," she said, extending her hand. "I was in the conference room earlier. I couldn't help overhearing your interview." Lucas's heart sank. Of course, she'd heard. Another person here to tell him he wasn't good enough. But instead of dismissiveness, her voice held a different tone, one of interest, maybe even admiration. "Look, I know that wasn't the best experience," Helena continued, noting Lucas's expression. "Marcos can be harsh. Harsh is putting it lightly, Lucas muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. He wasn't sure if he was more embarrassed that someone had witnessed his humiliation or relieved that someone understood. Helena smiled knowingly. He's got his way of doing things, but I don't agree with everything he says. I was impressed by the fact that you taught yourself how to code. That's not easy, especially without the formal support most people here have. Lucas blinked in surprise. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the effort he'd put into his skills. I appreciate that, but I'm not sure it makes a difference. I still don't belong here, apparently. Helena shook her head. That's where you're wrong. Talent and determination like yours? Those are exactly the things that should belong here. It's just that people like Marcos can't see past their own narrow idea of success. Lucas wasn't sure what to say. Her words were encouraging, but after what he'd just been through, it was hard to shake the weight of doubt pressing on him. I've been working with startups for years, Helena said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. I can spot potential when I see it, and Lucas, you have potential. You don't need tech vision or people like Marcos to validate your worth. There are other paths. She handed him her business card. I know some investors who are always looking for fresh, innovative ideas. They don't care about where you went to school, just what you can create. If you're interested, give me a call. We can talk about what's next. Lucas stared at the card in his hand. It was simple, professional, just her name, Helena Reyes, and her contact information. For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Helena replied with a smile. And don't let one bad interview stop you from going after what you deserve. Lucas nodded, his grip tightening around the card. As Helena turned to leave, Lucas watched her disappear into the crowd, feeling something stir inside him, something that had been buried beneath layers of doubt. For the first time since leaving the interview, the city felt a little less overwhelming. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a path forward. The small kitchen table in Lucas's apartment was now cluttered with sketches, notes, and his laptop, its screen glowing as he pored over his plans. Days had passed since his encounter with Helena, and the initial sense of humiliation from the TechVision interview had begun to fade. In its place, a new sense of purpose had taken root, fragile but growing stronger with each passing day. Helena's business card lay next to his laptop, a constant reminder of the opportunity she had offered him. Lucas had hesitated at first, unsure if he was truly ready to take such a leap. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was his chance to prove to himself, and maybe even to Marcos, that he didn't need the validation of a big company to succeed. He had been working non-stop for the past few days, barely leaving his apartment. The ideas that had once been vague concepts in his mind were now taking shape, one line of code at a time. His startup would focus on a niche in artificial intelligence that he had long been passionate about, creating AI tools that were accessible to small businesses, not just giant corporations. He knew there was a market for it, companies that couldn't afford the massive AI solutions offered by giants like TechVision but still needed the technology to grow. His mother would occasionally peek into the room, concerned by how focused he had become, but she understood that something had shifted in him. She didn't ask many questions, simply offering him food and encouragement when she could. It wasn't easy. The hours were long, and there were moments when Lucas's frustration boiled over. Sometimes the code wouldn't work, or his ideas seemed too ambitious for one person to handle. He wasn't just battling technical challenges, he was fighting the lingering self-doubt that crept into his mind when things went wrong. The memory of Marcos's condescending laughter would surface, and Lucas would feel the sting all over again. But each time he felt like giving up, he'd look at Helena's card and remember her words. You have potential. It wasn't just a throwaway line to her, she had seen something in him that day, something worth believing in. That belief, as distant as it sometimes felt, kept him going. A few nights later, Lucas finally completed the first working prototype of his AI tool. It wasn't perfect, it still needed refining, but it worked. He watched as the program ran smoothly on his screen, processing data and producing results just as he had envisioned. The satisfaction was unlike anything he had felt before. This was his creation, something he had built from the ground up, without the backing of a giant corporation or a prestigious degree. With the prototype ready, it was time to take the next step. Lucas knew he couldn't do it alone, he needed help, and more importantly, he needed funding. His savings were running low, and while his mother never complained, Lucas knew he couldn't keep relying on her meager income to sustain them both. The thought weighed heavily on him, adding urgency to his efforts. He reached for Helena's card once again. His fingers traced the embossed letters as he took a deep breath. This was it. No more hesitation. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Helena speaking. Hi, it's Lucas, he said, his voice steadier than he expected. I'm ready. Helena paused for a moment, then her voice softened with a smile. I was hoping you'd call. How's the project coming along? I've got a working prototype, Lucas replied, a hint of pride slipping into his tone. It's not finished, but it's functional. I think it could really make a difference for small businesses. That's fantastic, Helena said, her enthusiasm evident. I'll set up a meeting with some investors I know. They're always looking for innovative projects, and I think yours could be exactly what they're interested in. Lucas felt a surge of excitement. Thank you. I really appreciate this. No need to thank me yet, Helena replied. The real work is just beginning. Investors can be tough, but I believe in what you're doing, and I'll be there to help you through it. Just be prepared for some hard questions. Lucas smiled, feeling a strange mix of nerves and excitement. I'll be ready. As he hung up the phone, Lucas leaned back in his chair, staring at the cluttered table in front of him. The journey ahead was still daunting, and there were no guarantees of success. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. The city outside his window buzzed with life, the same city that had once felt like an impenetrable fortress. Now, Lucas felt like he had finally found a way in. His path wasn't traditional, but it was his, and that was all that mattered. The conference room buzzed with excitement as Lucas stood at the head of the table, presenting his project to a small group of investors. Helena had set up the meeting, and while Lucas had been nervous about facing tough questions, he found himself more confident than he expected. He had spent weeks perfecting his presentation, refining his pitch, and ensuring his prototype was as polished as possible. Now, as the investors asked questions, Lucas felt a sense of validation. How do you plan to scale this? One of the investors asked, his brow furrowed in thought as he looked over the presentation materials. Lucas, standing tall, responded confidently. The AI tool was designed to be modular, allowing small businesses to customize it to their needs without the high costs of larger systems. As demand grows, the software can grow with them. It's cost-effective and scalable. Helena sat quietly at the end of the table, observing the interaction. Her presence was a source of reassurance for Lucas, a reminder that he wasn't doing this alone. The investors seemed impressed, nodding as they considered the potential of his project. By the end of the meeting, Lucas had secured the first round of funding for his startup. It was a modest amount, but enough to get things off the ground and build a small team. As he left the meeting, Helena caught up to him in the hallway, her smile wide. You did great in there, she said, giving him a pat on the back. Thanks, Lucas replied, a mix of relief and excitement in his voice. I couldn't have done it without your help. Don't sell yourself short, she said. You've got something special here. Now comes the hard part, turning this into a real business. Lucas knew she was right. The success of securing investors was just the first step. Now, the real work began. In the following months, Lucas threw himself into building his startup. He hired a small team of developers and designers, each one as passionate about the project as he was. The office they worked in was small, just a rented space in a co-working building, but it felt like home. The hum of keyboards, the scribbling of ideas on whiteboards, and the shared excitement of creating something new fueled the atmosphere. The product itself quickly gained traction. Small businesses, attracted by the affordability and simplicity of Lucas's AI tool, began signing up. Word spread quickly through online forums and business networks. Every time a new client signed on, Lucas felt a surge of pride. His creation was no longer just an idea, it was making a real impact. But with growth came challenges. As more businesses adopted the tool, Lucas and his team found themselves working around the clock to meet the increasing demands. Bugs in the software needed fixing, new features had to be developed, and customer support requests piled up. What had once been a small, manageable project was rapidly evolving into something much bigger, and with it, the pressure mounted. Lucas often found himself staying late at the office, long after his team had gone home. He'd stare at his screen, reviewing lines of code, troubleshooting issues that seemed to grow more complex by the day. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He couldn't let his clients down, and more importantly, he couldn't afford to fail. Too many people were counting on him, his team, his investors, and his family. One night, as he sat alone in the dimly lit office, Helena called. "How's everything going?" she asked, her tone light, but with a hint of concern. "Busy," Lucas replied, rubbing his eyes. "The product's doing well, but it's a lot to handle. I wasn't expecting it to grow this fast." "That's a good problem to have," Helena said with a soft laugh. "But remember, you don't have to do it all yourself. You've got a team. Trust them." Lucas leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion catching up to him. He knew Helena was right, but letting go of control wasn't easy. This was his dream, his creation, and the fear of things falling apart if he didn't manage every detail gnawed at him. "I know," Lucas admitted. "It's just, I don't want to mess this up. You won't, Helena assured him. You've already proven yourself. Now you need to trust the people around you to help carry the load. No one can build something great alone. Lucas sat in silence for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right, as always. He had to learn to delegate, to rely on the team he had built, or else the pressure would crush him. Thanks, Helena, Lucas said, his voice softer now, a mix of gratitude and tiredness. Anytime. And don't forget to sleep once in a while, she added with a teasing tone before hanging up. Lucas smiled, feeling a little lighter. He glanced around the empty office, realizing that, while the journey was far from over, he wasn't walking it alone anymore. While Lucas's startup was gaining traction and making headlines in niche tech circles, the atmosphere at TechVision had taken a sharp turn. What had once been the crown jewel of the city's tech industry was now showing signs of wear. Marcos sat in his corner office, staring at a report on his desk. The numbers didn't lie, growth had stagnated, and their competitors were eating into their market share. It had been a gradual decline, one that Marcos had been too proud to see coming. For years, TechVision had dominated the AI space, signing lucrative deals with large corporations and government contracts. But now, smaller, more agile startups were undercutting them, offering innovative solutions at a fraction of the cost. And to make matters worse, their own internal projects were riddled with delays and budget overruns. Marcos slammed the report down on his desk, frustration boiling over. He had built TechVision from the ground up, making a name for himself as one of the most powerful CEOs in the industry. He had always prided himself on his vision, his ability to stay ahead of the curve. But now, for the first time in his career, the ground was slipping beneath him. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His COO, David, entered the room, his face grim. "We need to talk," David said, taking a seat across from Marcos without waiting for an invitation. Marcos didn't respond, his jaw clenched tightly. He knew what was coming. "We've lost 3 more clients this quarter," David continued, his voice steady but laced with concern. "They've switched to smaller competitors. We're being outpaced, Marcos, and what do you suggest we do about it?" Marcos snapped, his eyes narrowing. "We've got the resources. We've got the reputation." David shook his head. "That's the problem. We've relied too much on our past success. The industry's changing, and we're not keeping up." Marcos glared at him, refusing to acknowledge the truth in David's words. He had always believed that his company's legacy would carry them through any storm. But the storm they were in now wasn't like the others. It wasn't just competition, it was the entire industry evolving in ways he hadn't anticipated. "We need new blood, fresh ideas," David pressed. "Our current projects are too rigid, too expensive. The market is shifting toward more flexible, cost-effective solutions that companies like Lucas's are offering." At the mention of Lucas, Marcos's expression darkened. He remembered the young man he had dismissed in that interview, the kid who had dared to think he could play in the big leagues. And now, it seemed that same kid was playing, and playing well. "We're not chasing after small-time startups," Marcos growled. "TechVision is a giant in this industry. We don't need to lower ourselves to that level." David's silence said more than words could. He stood, leaving Marcos alone in his office, the weight of his pride pulling him deeper into denial. It was a crisp, clear morning when Lucas received an email that made him pause mid-scroll. The subject line read simply, "A proposal from Marcos Valente, CEO of TechVision." For a moment, Lucas just stared at the screen, his heart beating a little faster. He hadn't heard that name in months, not since the humiliating interview that had almost shattered his confidence. Back then, he had been a desperate job seeker, trying to convince a man who had barely spared him a glance that he was worth something. Now, the tables had turned. Lucas had built something of his own, and it was Marcos who was reaching out to him. He clicked the email open, reading it carefully. The message was brief and formal, requesting a meeting to discuss potential business collaboration. It was framed as an opportunity for TechVision to invest in Lucas's growing startup. Lucas leaned back in his chair, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. So this was how things had come full circle. The same man who had dismissed him, who had questioned his worth, was now seeking a partnership. It wasn't lost on Lucas that Marcos hadn't mentioned their previous encounter in the email. Perhaps Marcos hoped Lucas had forgotten. But Lucas hadn't forgotten. He remembered every word of that interview, every dismissive look. And now, as he sat in his modest office, surrounded by the fruits of his hard work, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Yet, alongside that satisfaction, there was something else, a nagging sense of curiosity. What did Marcos really want? 2 days later, Lucas found himself walking into a high-end coffee shop in the heart of the city. It was a sleek, modern space, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in natural light. Lucas spotted Marcos immediately, sitting at a table near the back, his posture rigid, his expression as unreadable as ever. Taking a deep breath, Lucas approached. As he neared the table, Marcos stood, extending his hand. Lucas hesitated for a brief moment before shaking it. The last time they had met, Marcos hadn't even bothered to stand or offer a hand. This was a different dynamic. "Lucas," Marcos said, his voice calm and businesslike. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Of course," Lucas replied, taking a seat. He kept his expression neutral, though inside, he was keenly aware of the shift in power. This time, he wasn't the one seeking approval. Marcos wasted no time. "I've been following your work," he began, folding his hands on the table. "Your company has been making impressive strides in the AI space. I think there's a real opportunity here for both of us." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Both of us?" Marcos nodded, his tone measured. "TechVision is interested in investing in your startup. With our resources and your innovation, I believe we could achieve great things together. You've built something remarkable, but with the right backing, you could take it even further." Lucas studied Marcos's face, noting the slight tension around his eyes. He knew this wasn't just about investment, it was about survival. TechVision was struggling, and Lucas's company had become a threat. Marcos wasn't here out of admiration for Lucas's work, he was here because he needed something. "And what exactly would TechVision be bringing to the table?" Lucas asked, his voice steady. "You've got the resources, sure, but I've done pretty well without them so far." Marcos's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he kept his composure. "You've made impressive progress, no doubt. But scaling a business is a whole different challenge. With TechVision's infrastructure and experience, we could help you expand far beyond what you're capable of on your own." Lucas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He could feel the weight of the decision looming over him. Part of him wanted to laugh at the irony of it all. Marcos, the man who had once told him he didn't belong, was now sitting across from him, practically offering him a lifeline. But there was something deeply unsatisfying about the idea of aligning himself with someone who had once dismissed his worth. "What's the catch?" Lucas asked, cutting through the polite conversation. Marcos's expression remained neutral, but his eyes flickered. "No catch," he said smoothly. "Just a mutually beneficial partnership. TechVision takes a minority stake in your company, and in return, we provide capital and expertise to help you scale. You stay in control?" Lucas paused, considering the offer. It was tempting, more capital, more resources, more growth. But he couldn't shake the memory of that first interview. Could he really trust Marcos, or was this just another way for the older man to regain control? "I appreciate the offer, Marcos," Lucas said, his voice calm but firm. "But I think I'll pass." Marcos blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct refusal. "Pass? You'd be turning down an opportunity to grow your company faster than you could on your own?" "I've done fine without TechVision so far," Lucas said, rising to his feet. "And I plan to keep it that way." Marcos stood as well, his face carefully neutral, but Lucas could sense the tension beneath. For a brief moment, the two men stood there, the power dynamics between them starkly reversed from that fateful interview months ago. With a final nod, Lucas turned and walked out of the cafe, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The offer had been tempting, but he knew deep down that aligning himself with Marcos would have been a step backward. He had built this company on his own terms, and he wasn't about to let someone like Marcos change that. As Lucas stepped out of the cafe and into the busy city streets, a wave of clarity washed over him. The cool air was a welcome relief from the tension inside, and with each step he took, the weight of the encounter with Marcos seemed to lift. He had made his choice, and despite the enormity of what he had just turned down, Lucas felt lighter, freer. It wasn't that Marcos's offer hadn't been tempting. For a brief moment, sitting in that cafe, Lucas had imagined what it might be like to have the backing of a major player like TechVision. The resources, the infrastructure, the sheer speed at which his startup could grow with that kind of investment. But then, just as quickly, he had remembered who was sitting across from him. Marcos wasn't offering help, he was offering control, disguised as opportunity. Walking through the crowded streets, Lucas replayed the moment in his mind when he had said no. There had been no anger, no resentment in his voice, just a calm, steady conviction. He wasn't the same young man who had walked into TechVision months ago, desperate for approval. He had built something real, something that mattered, and he wasn't about to give that up. By the time Lucas reached his apartment, his mind was already racing with plans for what came next. The encounter with Marcos had only solidified his resolve. If he had needed any further proof that he was on the right path, it had just been handed to him in that meeting. Lucas now understood that his success didn't need validation from people like Marcos. It never had. Later that evening, Lucas sat at his cluttered desk, the familiar glow of his laptop illuminating the room. His team had grown, the workload had intensified, and the challenges were more complex than ever, but Lucas wouldn't have it any other way. Each new obstacle was a chance to grow, to learn, and to push his company forward on his own terms. As he looked over the latest feedback from users of his AI tool, Lucas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The product was evolving rapidly, and the small businesses using it were already reporting improvements in efficiency and productivity. That was what mattered, seeing the tangible impact his work was having. These were the people he had set out to help, and they were the reason he had built his company in the first place. Helena had been right all along. Lucas didn't need to do this alone, but that didn't mean he needed someone like Marcos to steer the ship. His team, his product, and his vision were enough. He had the support of his colleagues and investors who believed in him for the right reasons, because of what he could create, not because of what he could give them in return. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Helena. "How did the meeting go?" Lucas smiled and quickly typed back, "I turned him down. Best decision I've made." Her reply came almost instantly. "Good. I knew you'd see through it." Lucas leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. Helena had been with him since the beginning, and in many ways, she had helped him see the path forward more clearly than he ever could have on his own. But now, more than ever, Lucas knew that the decisions he made, whether big or small, were his alone to bear. The city hummed outside his window, a reminder of the relentless pace of the world around him. But for the first time in a long time, Lucas didn't feel like he was running to catch up. He was moving forward at his own speed, guided by his own vision. There was still so much to do, so many obstacles to overcome, but now, he had no doubt that he could do it. He was ready for whatever came next, and he would face it without compromise. Months passed, and Lucas's startup continued to grow beyond his wildest expectations. The AI tool that he and his team had developed was now being used by hundreds of small businesses across the country. Each new client brought a renewed sense of purpose to Lucas, validating all the sacrifices and long hours he had poured into his work. The office, once a modest co-working space, was now bustling with activity. His team had grown from just a handful of developers to a full-fledged company, complete with departments for marketing, customer support, and operations. Lucas had learned to delegate, trusting his team to handle the day-to-day tasks while he focused on the bigger picture. It wasn't easy at first. He had been so used to doing everything himself, but now he realized how much more his company could accomplish with the right people in place. One afternoon, as Lucas was reviewing reports in his office, his assistant knocked on the door. "Lucas, you might want to see this," she said, handing him a copy of a tech industry news report. The headline caught his attention immediately: "TechVision faces major layoffs amid financial struggles." Lucas's eyes scanned the article quickly. TechVision, the giant that had once dominated the industry, was now on the verge of collapse. The report detailed how their failure to adapt to new market trends had led to massive client losses and internal turmoil. Layoffs were imminent, and the company's stock had plummeted. He set the paper down, feeling a mix of emotions. There was a part of him that wanted to feel vindicated, to revel in the irony of Marcos's downfall after everything that had happened between them. But instead, Lucas just felt a quiet sense of closure. He had moved on from that chapter of his life, and TechVision's struggles no longer felt relevant to his journey. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Helena. "Did you see the news about TechVision?" Lucas replied quickly, "I saw it." "Hard to believe." Helena's response came almost immediately. "Not really. They've been stuck in the past for years. You were right to go your own way." Lucas smiled to himself. He had indeed chosen the right path, one that had led him to success on his own terms. The memory of Marcos and the humiliation he had faced at TechVision had faded, replaced by a stronger sense of purpose and confidence. Lucas wasn't driven by the need to prove anyone wrong anymore. He was driven by the desire to continue building something meaningful. Later that evening, Lucas sat in his office, long after the rest of his team had gone home. The city lights flickered outside his window, casting a soft glow over the room. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on how far he had come. His company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, and it was making a real difference in the lives of the people who used his product. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his lead developer, Sarah, one of the first people he had hired when the company was just getting off the ground. "Hey, we just signed another big client," Sarah said, a smile lighting up her face. "Thought you'd want to know." Lucas grinned, the pride swelling in his chest. "That's amazing news." "Great work, Sarah." She lingered for a moment, looking at him thoughtfully. "You know, Lucas, it's kind of crazy how far we've come. I remember when it was just you and a handful of us in that tiny office. Now look at us." Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Yeah, it's been a wild ride. But this is just the beginning. As Sarah left, Lucas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had been standing on these same streets, nervous and uncertain about his future. Now, he was leading a successful company, surrounded by people who believed in his vision. He had faced doubt, rejection, and more challenges than he could count, but through it all, he had stayed true to himself. Lucas wasn't just a kid from the wrong side of town anymore. He was a self-made entrepreneur, and he had done it all without compromising his values or relying on those who doubted him. As the city buzzed below him, Lucas knew that this was just the start. There were more goals to achieve, more heights to reach, and he was ready for whatever came next. His journey had taught him that success wasn't just about reaching the top, it was about the people you helped along the way and the integrity you maintained as you climbed. And with that thought, Lucas smiled, ready to face the future. And you? Have you ever had a time when you were underestimated by someone who didn't believe in your potential? How did you react? Perhaps Lucas' story awakened in you the desire to transform challenges into opportunities, just like he did. What would you do in his place, when faced with the same millionaire who humiliated you, asking for help? Click on the video that is on the screen now to continue your journey of self-knowledge and discover how learning from difficult situations can lead you to success. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes full of lessons on overcoming and growth. See you in the next video.